Beth is here to talk to us about C's and S's, and this is, I don't know what number in a series that we're doing on level 2 skills.
Yep.
And this should get you one farther to making this bad boy right over
Yep.
here.
Yep. So
So,
this one and the next one are both addressing that while not being literal. So it's building the skills that then you can go, oh, now I see how to connect that to the, because it's, you know, yeah, you got to still sort that puppy out. So groovy. All right, I'm
right.
going to take over then.
Excellent. Beth. So,
Screen share. So yeah, CBA level 2 skills, C's and S scrolls to measure, not just making C's and S's, but making them so they hopefully come out correctly, the right length, the right size, and all kind of that. And once again, it's a co-production of CBA and Vista Forge, who has been supporting all of my work on doing this stuff. It's been great. So I'm going to start with just a little, what and why. And I think I'm going to talk about those questions in reverse order. Why and what. So C's and S's are super common in all kinds of grill work. Here's a couple of grills with just nothing but C scrolls and collars. I think these are both Italian. I saw these at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which if you are ever anywhere near there, you need to spend, well, one day would be a scant minimum, but they have ironwork galleries that go from one side of the museum to the other, continuous ironwork. It's amazing. So there's some just nothing but C scrolls. Here's some S scrolls. This is in a French piece that's now at the Isabel Stewart Garden Museum in Boston. This is the City Hall of Sheffield, England. Some great scroll work in there. And the same skills, even when you're not strictly doing a C or an S, the ability to consistently produce scrolls that are going to look the same and match each other for stuff with joinery. It's the same thing we're talking about. And of course, why do these? Because the CBA Level 2 grill does require them. You need to do 2 S's or 2 C's. And I think Victoria can correct me on this, but the Level 2 grill requires that you do a frame that has 2 upset square corners held together with 2 mortise and tenon joints. And then you have to fill it with 2 C scrolls or 2 S scrolls with 4 finials, one from each of these scroll families, and there have to be collars. If you do this design, you can just do it and submit it, and if it's good enough, great. If you want to do something that's different, has some C scrolls in it, that can be legitimate too, but you should do the drawing first and submit it to the powers that be. I'd start with Victoria. Just send it to Victoria and say, Victoria, can you make sure people check this out and say it's okay? Before you actually produce it to make sure you're cool. And the whole point is that you can actually do something that's drawn on a piece of paper. So what is a C scroll or an S scroll? Well, these are scrolls that have a symmetry to them, either a left-right symmetry like these C scrolls have, or an axial symmetry in the case of an S scroll. Other things that they need to do that make them look symmetric is I think it's important that the finial angles, so what direction these guys are pointed, that those be symmetrical. If those are a little off, you tend to notice it. And if those are the same, other sins might be forgivable. The other thing is that they need to fill the space correctly. So this guy needs to fill the same kind of space as this guy if we're going to put them together and actually make something. So that's what those guys are. And S scroll, this is what axial symmetry is. Axial symmetry means that when you spin it, if you're looking here, it looks about the same. What comes up again, turn it 180, and gosh, that looks similar. That's axial symmetry, as opposed to mirror symmetry, where you could chop half of it off and put a mirror there. So, okay, 2 scrolls, 1 bar. I've been making scrolls. What's so hard about that? They can be surprisingly difficult. First of all, they do have to be the right size for the space. So, one of these S scrolls in the level 2 grill, not only does it have to exactly touch the top and the bottom, but the width has to be exactly 1/2 of the width of the frame to fill that space just right. Yeah. And depending on what you're making, it may be a little more complicated. These guys meet on a diagonal instead, so that's a little more interesting. They also need to meet at the right contact points. If this C and this S, they meet right here, they meet right here. These collaring spots, these meeting spots, are mirror images of each other. So if you got this C a little bit wrong and it touched the S over here or over here, it wouldn't look right. So it's more than just filling the space. It's also getting all the contacts in the right spots. And to make all that happen, you have to start off with a bar that's the right length, because you're going to scroll it from both ends and you have to use the whole bar, and you've only got that whole bar, and you have to make it do all those things, fill the space, be symmetrical. So here's some examples. I will not name the poor smith who made this. But this is a C scroll that starts out okay here, and then it's clearly way too short. So it never filled the space, and it wasn't going to come around to the same angle as it is here. This S scroll was apparently too long. It had to have a lot of swoop added into it in order to squeeze it into the frame. This has been twisted around a little bit more than this guy in order to fit it in. So we need to get the starting length of our original bar right. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to do that, because if that happens, then the rest of it's probably going to be okay. Before you do this stuff, the things I'm going to teach today, before you try making a scrolling jig and before you try doing C's and S's, these are some skills that I think you should have down that will help you to do this more successfully. You should have done some nice hand turn scrolls and played around with various scroll finials, different endings. Doing those is going to teach you a ton about being able to see shapes and control bends. So the ability to see the shapes is incredibly important. The ability to use negative space to see what's going on. The ability to look at a curved bar and see where the curve is right and where the curve is wrong, and how you should fix it. That's incredibly important for success in this stuff. Should have a good understanding of where the connection between where the heat is and where the bend is, and consistent heat, consistent bend, inconsistent heat, inconsistent bend. We're trying to make really consistent things here, so we need to make sure that we really get that. It would help if you've done some drawing for forging. You're gonna need to make C's and S's, you have to have some constraints. They're supposed to fit a space. So you're either working from your own drawing or you're working from somebody else's drawing. And I think it's great to actually have done a bit of drawing for forging. At a certain point, you need to be able to produce that piece of paper that shows what something's going to be like, and then forge to it. If you're only forging to other people's drawings, that's really limiting. And you should be working on building up your ability to yourself do appropriate quality control, your ability to look at it and go, that's actually not really good enough. It's got some problems. I'm not talking about the over self-critical, nothing's ever good enough, it has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be right in the right ways. So appropriate quality control, that's what we're talking about there. All right, so here's the plan for the evening. And this is sort of running down the general methods that are involved here. But what we're going to do, we're going to start with transferring our drawing, talking about how to do that, because we have to work to a drawing. But if you work to a paper drawing with hot metal, you very quickly have charred paper and maybe a fire. So we do need to transfer to some steel before we can really work with it well. Trying to shortcut that doesn't work. Then we're going to talk about making jigs. If you're going to make consistent scrolls, you're going to want a jig. And I'm going to give you the 5-cent super fast version of how to make a jig and encourage you to take much longer to do so. Then we're going to spend some time estimating the length in a half a scroll. In order to get that bar cut to the right length to make a nice scroll, we got to start off with halves. So half a C or half an S, estimating its length, then doing a test forging where we work everything out and make sure that what we're getting is what we actually want for half of a scroll. And that gives us some measurements that we need to be able to do the calculations so that we can actually cut the bar the right length to forge a whole C scroll. Here's a C scroll being forged. So it's got one end done and one end happening. Whoops. And we're going to spend a little time talking about adjustment. What if you finished it and gosh, look, it didn't quite fit on the drawing perfectly? Intelligent approaches to doing some adjusting other than just messing things around and hoping it works. And then we'll finish by spending a little time going back to the jig, which you're going to see me use a bunch of times, but talking specifically about how to use a jig successfully and some ways to not use the jig and what to do if you do that. And then we'll finish off with a little chat about alternate finials. I'm actually going to do this whole thing with just a simple ribbon taper because it's quick and elegant and uncomplicated. And as soon as you start doing more interesting finials, like the level 2 grille, it gets a little bit more interesting. And so we'll have a little chat about that and hopefully make sure that everybody gets what they need. All right. Any questions before we get going? Nothing there. So transferring the drawing. First thing we need to do, anytime you're making something that has multiple parts, you really probably want to have a drawing unless you're doing a Viking lock. And you're going to want to transfer the drawing to a sheet of steel so that you can work with it. So the things you're going to need your paper drawing, full size. You're going to need some blackboard chalk. I prefer non-white, and I'll show you why. You just need to grab your rasp out of your blacksmithing bag, some tape. I like using a slightly low tack masking tape. You're going to want a pencil, slightly dull pencil. We'll talk about why. And what I'm calling brightener, which is just like a charcoal pencil or a silver pencil, or even just some soapstone so that we can make the lines a little bit brighter. Let's take a moment to talk about the paper drawing. Do not transfer the drawing from your original, ever. Save your original, reproduce it, go down to the reprographics place. That's the key word you want, by the way. If you're doing anything larger than just like legal size paper, don't go to the copy shop, go to the reprographics place. They're the folks who do blueprints, and they can crank stuff out of their giant roller printer for you at full size, no problem. But copy it a few times and work with one of the copies so that you've always got backup in case anything goes wrong, right? So the other thing you're going to need is a piece of rusty sheet metal on which to transfer the drawing. Now, here's what you don't want. You don't want a nice, shiny, fresh piece of cold rolled. Ooh, it's so shiny, it's silver, because you're not going to get anything to leave a mark on that except like a Sharpie, and that's not going to work for us. And that fantastic piece of sheet metal, it's been sitting around getting a marvelous patina, the little outside, whatever. That's great, but don't transfer directly to it straight off because it's got a bunch of little spots of loose rust on here. And if I draw on that, then as I'm using it, it's likely those loose spots of rust will come off and my line will go with it. And my lines will end up as dotted lines instead of solid lines. So take your nice rusty, well patinaed sheet and give it a good brushing so that what's left is well adhered to the sheet and you've got a surface that's going to take chalk well. Okie dokie, let's prep the drawing. So grab your chalk, grab your rasp, and just grind some chalk dust onto the back of your drawing using the rasp. I don't know, about half a stick works for, I think this is a legal size sheet of paper. That seems to be about enough. And then just rub it into the paper. You're going to get messy. And this is where using colored chalk helps you to see where the heck it is and where it's a little thinner, where you need to rub a little more on. If you do sewing, you may recognize this as we're making transfer paper. And if you're old enough like me, you'll go, oh, we're making a chalky, cheap version of carbon paper. So yep, that's what we're doing. Get it all rubbed in there everywhere where you might need it. Blow off the loose dust. The loose dust doesn't do anything good for you. If you have loose dust on there, you turn this thing over onto your sheet of steel and you leave a little, well, in this case, pink cloud of fogginess on your drawing. And that's not going to help. So this is ready now. And now we can transfer the drawing. So before you transfer the drawing, tape it down. It's so easy. You are certain you're not moving it and you accidentally move it and you'll never get it exactly overlapped again. So tape it down and don't just tape it on the top. Tape it in a few spots so that it doesn't kind of inch up a little bit as you're working on it, and suddenly you find that you're off when you didn't think you were. And then simply trace it with a pencil. Now, why am I using a pencil specifically? Because I'm pretty specific about that. Use a pencil. A slightly dull pencil is going to glide along your drawing. It's going to handle any little lumps and bumps from the rust really well and give you a nice consistent pressure for transferring the line. If you use a ballpoint pen, it tends to skip over the slightly rough surface a lot. It's likely to tear. And I have more than once actually collapsed the ball of the ballpoint into the pen, just destroying it, and then made a hole in the drawing. So really don't use the ballpoint. And not too sharp a pencil, because a sharp pencil could also put cut a hole in your drawing. So a slightly dull pencil is just the ticket here. Trace it a little bit, and then, you know what, lift it up and have a peek and make sure it's transferring. Yay, it's working. That's reassuring. I'll tape that back down and go back and just trace every single line on there. And, you know, with the pencil, you should be able to see where it's got that nice graphite shine. You can tell where you've been. One suggestion: don't just lay your hand on the paper and start tracing, because every time you scoot your hand over to get a better angle, you'll rub some chalk onto the steel. So I just take my shop rag and fold it up, and I rest my hand on that so that I've got a little cushioning and I'm not accidentally leaving a lot of extra marks on the steel. And that should give us a nice clean transfer. Hey, that looks great. I can't say it's the darkest markings I ever saw, but that's really pretty good. So the next thing we want to do is to brighten that up, because that's not really dark, and that's a really soft chalk that will wipe off super easily. So let's use something that might not wipe off as easily. So you could use your soapstone, just grab your soapstone. But if you do, you might want to sharpen a little bit by rubbing it on something so you get a little bit of a point. I sometimes I've done some of my stuff with a silver pencil. This is just a colored pencil from the art store that's silver. I think it has aluminum in it. And the aluminum is the thing that stays behind and can put up a little heat and still leave a mark. But my present most favorite, I think I learned this one from the folks at Adams Forge, thank you, is charcoal white. Go to the art supply store in the charcoal drawing section, and they'll have these white pencils. And it's harder than regular chalk, so you can sharpen it a little bit better, but it leaves a super bright line, and it can actually put up with some heat and not rub off right away. So it's a really great thing. One note is, if whatever you're tracing this with is really thick, then you're going to get a thick line and you've lost precision in your drawing. So think about that. You might want to keep your lines on the thin side to increase precision. I know that folks who are making things where they need extreme precision will not even use chalk. They will use a scribe on the steel, and then they can rub a little chalk dust into the scribed line so it's super thin. We don't need to do that level for level 2, but don't have a super fat line. And finally, run through the whole thing and add some helpful tick marks that help you keep track of where things are. So I definitely think it's a good idea to add center lines that are going to help you see where the centers are on your scrolls. There's the center of my S scroll where the vertical center line and the horizontal center line meet. This line is going to help me to judge the symmetry of this end of my C scroll. And I've also got these little arrows in all the places where I want my collars to be. So that's telling me where the two scrolls need to touch each other. So put in those hints so that you've got more to work with, but you definitely need to have the halfway mark on C scrolls or S scrolls marked, or you cannot make them successfully. All right, that looks great. So that's a really good drawing to be working with. Should give us what we need. Side note, before we get going on making these guys, before you make C's and S's to match your drawing, you really should make the frame. And if you're not making the frame, then you should make a frame. So if you were going to make something that involved tons and tons of C's or S's, make a frame that will hold precisely 2 of them in the correct arrangement so that you can make sure that they are actually the right size. Because things can look perfectly right on the drawing, and then when you go to put them together, there's a millimeter gap here and a millimeter gap there and a millimeter gap here, and the next thing you know, the whole thing is just not fitting together right. So frame first, and then you can check out the fit of your scrolls as you make them and make sure everything is working right. All righty. So to make symmetrical scrolls to measure, you really do need to have a shaping tool. And in the shop I grew up in, we called it a jig. I think in the Coursera book, they call it a scroll tool, which I don't use that word because there's a lot of scroll tools. There's scrolling tongs. Those are scroll tools. And there's scrolling wrenches. Those are scroll tools. And there's scrolling forks. Those are scroll tools. So I just find that confusing. I did take a class a couple of years ago with an eminent blacksmith who, when I referred to a jig, jumped down my throat and said, no, welders use jigs. Blacksmiths use forms. So, okay, whatever. I think it's true that welders definitely use things like this differently from how we as blacksmiths use them. So we're going to call it what you will, but we're going to use it like a blacksmith. So features of a good jig. Well, and these are key sort of quality control things that you're going to have to look after if you're making one of these puppies, and you're going to need to make one of these puppies. So the bottom should be flat. The sides should be vertical. The sides should be vertical anywhere you look at it. Vertical, vertical. That's really important. And when I show you a bad jig, you'll see why. But that's what makes sure that we always get the same size and shape piece every time we use this. The inside of the scroll, where it comes around for a second time, should have a flare to it. It should be a little taller. So it's still flush on the bottom and it's straight up and down on the edge here, but it has a little flare so that we can start the scroll here and then cross over ourselves without it being a giant nightmare. The other thing is, I like to have the end have, I think Mark Asbury calls this a joggle, just a little bend. This is parallel to this part. So you just do a little bend down and then bend it back again. This part goes in the vise, and it gives me plenty of clearance space to work around my my jig without running my hand into the vise, which is extremely unpleasant. Some folks will bend this down 90 degrees and fold it up to make a boss for their hardy hole. And that's great. I have not done that because I teach in a shop with 30 forges, and that's 30 hardy holes. And I am likely to not fit well, and a bad fit just gives you very little control. So I'd rather go into the vise where it's always going to work. So here's why we have the joggle. Here's me coming around with the C scroll, and I'm having to come across the top here because it's too long. And you can see my tongs hanging out, and I don't have to worry about running into the side because I've got space over here, and my hand's not going to run into the vise. Thanks, joggle. Other features, look at it from the top. You can make this out of any stock you want. And I've seen plenty of these made out of 1/4 inch, 6 millimeter stock. I think that is a waste of your effort. You are likely to pull on this, push on this, hammer on this, and still want to have things come out the same. So you want this to really survive a little bit of abuse. And that means beefier stock is better. I like using 3/8 by inch. I think that works pretty well. I've seen them as thick as a 1/2 inch. That's a lot of work to bend, but it's going to put up with a lot. At the very end, I have to put a little taper on. There's a little taper starting here, comes down, just because I could not bend it this tight with the 3/8 square, right? That 3/8 thick stock. So I had to thin it some, but even so, I don't go too thin. This is not a scroll. It's the shape on the inside of the scroll. And in fact, one of the things that always throws me off on a scrolling jig is they're kind of ugly. A good scroll has beautiful negative space, and these have kind of meh negative space because they live in the negative space. The other thing I'll say about when you're making a jig is make more than you need. It is a fair amount of work getting this first part started, and then this next bit and this next bit. So this one, I needed it to come out to here on the bottom. But how much more work was it once I'd done all that hard work? How much more work was it to add another 1/4 of a turn of very gentle bend, which allows me to make much larger scrolls. So now I could use this to make bigger scrolls. I don't have to start them on the inside. I could start a scroll partway along, but I can make bigger scrolls with this, and I've got a lot more uses out of this jig from the work that I put into making it. So my suggestion, use thick stock, put in the time and make it a little bit bigger than you need, because you can use it for a lot more stuff. I use this to make heart trivets in Yosemite. Whip them out. It's great. So making the jig. And again, I'm giving you the 5-cent tour. There are so many ways to screw this up. This can be so profoundly frustrating. If you're methodical about it and double check everything every time and accept the fact that sometimes you will get things out of the fire and end up wasting the entire heat trying to figure out where you meant to bend it, you're going to be in better shape. I would set aside a full day minimum for making a jig. Do not expect to get it done in less than 8 hours. That will help you to actually get it done successfully. So you need a drawn line. This jig, JC, is that's actually a golden ratio scroll. So which if you Google golden ratio spiral on the interwebs, you will find it in left-handed and right-handed versions, and you can print it out, and there you go. If you're using a drawing of a piece where you're like, okay, I got to match that, I would trace a separate tracing, separate from the drawing that the transfer you just did, of just the line that's the inside edge of the scroll, because the scrolling jig is for the inside edge, right? The outside of the jig is where the inside of the scroll goes when you're using it. I have seen students use their original drawing that had the thickness of the scroll on it, had the outside of the scroll and the inside of the scroll on the drawing. And at some point they accidentally switched which line they were on. And after hours of work ended up with a useless jig, which is so annoying. So make a separate drawing on a separate piece of steel that's just the scroll you're trying to do on that jig. Add some tick marks on it. I just put a little line out every quarter of a turn, which you notice do not line up because it is expanding. These really help you keep track of where things are going and help you with alignment. It is hard to align the scroll with the drawing so that you can tell where you need to change it. If you rotate it in and out, it will shrink and expand compared to the line. And then you also have the sliding left and right and the sliding up and down. So you have not 1 and 2, but 3 degrees of freedom on trying to get this guy to match that line. And that's a pain in the neck. Look, I'm not matching the line. That's not where it's supposed to be. When it's in the right place, the outside surface of the jig is matching the line. That's what you should be looking for. So this is how to make a jig. Start from the center. And when I say start from the center, I mean get that first half turn. You've got to forge your little flare. You've got to make sure that you've got it offset so the bottom is flat. You've got to make sure that the front edge is straight up and down. Do not have an angle or a swelling to the front edge. It should be straight up and down because it's part of the jig too. And then you start scrolling over the edge of the anvil with a hammer like you've done before. Just working on getting that first half turn to perfectly match the drawing. It might help if you put a mark on your drawing for where the inside end of the scroll is so that you know where to lay it down each time. That'll help a lot. So get your first half a turn and then put that tick mark on there so you know where that is. That's going to help a lot. That helps you know where you need to rotate to and move it around so that you actually have things lined up. And then start working your way along doing only a quarter turn at a time. So get half a turn perfect and then get the next quarter of a turn absolutely perfect. When you're doing that, the part you're working on, that's the part that should be hot. The part that was perfect before, you should quench it every single heat. It is so easy to be hammering over here to tighten things up and to have this part from the inertia unroll a little bit. And so then you've got this section perfect and you go back and you look at it and this section's not perfect anymore. Oh my God, no. So quench everything that you've completed, every single heat. Do a quarter of a turn at a time. Once you got this quarter done, put those 2 tick marks on. That's going to help you to lay this down on the drawing and figure out where your next section of work is to be done. Then work on the next quarter turn. till it's perfect. Then put that next tick mark on. So now you're using this tick mark and this tick mark, and you're going to quench it to just almost that tick every heat while you work on this section bit by bit. And it does get, eventually when you're up in here, it starts getting a little easier because it's just not as tight and you can use more tools to do it. But protect the work that's been done that's well. Only do a quarter of a turn at a time. I have definitely had students who have said, well, to heck with it. I've got this section working well, so I'm just going to keep working past that. And then I'll come back and finish the inside. But when you go to try and finish the inside, you can't even get to it. Right? You can't get that hammer in there through this wall. And all the lengths are wrong. So if it's not perfect on the inside and you try and go back and fix it, you're never going to get it fixed. Start from the middle, work your way out, get each quarter turn perfect. To help you with that, you want to use more than just your hammer and anvil. You will start with the hammer and the anvil. That's your starting spot, but it is really great to use scrolling forks and scrolling wrenches to do this. And there was an outstanding webinar by Victoria and Dennis Dushek on making scrolling wrenches and scrolling tongs, which are just the tools you need for this. So key features of good ones of these: the two sides need to be parallel. If they're parallel, then they're going to bend the whole length, the whole height of a piece consistently. And we need to have the inside surfaces where they're touching the metal, inside surfaces. Those need to be well-rounded because those will be sliding across the metal. And if they're not well-rounded, you're going to gall the metal and leave all kinds of nasty marks. It really helps to have forks with different openings. And some of them, some of the smaller openings, you might want to have more delicate fingers on so it can reach in there better. I love doing these guys where I'm just bending a bit around metal until they're parallel up top, and I can throw that in the vise, and that's a tool. Yay. These are not good tools. What's going on here? Well, this is a great mechanics wrench I got. I rounded the jaws a bit, but look, they're not parallel. So down at the bottom, they're not going to bend as tightly as they will at the top. So this thing's going to bend stuff into a conic section instead of just bending it into a nice parallel sided thing. This one, this was a guy I knew who was doing this with a plasma cutter and plate, and very spiffy, but that opening is, again, not parallel sided. It's great having two sizes on one piece, right? But this, I need to heat this up, put a spacer in there, and hammer the one finger down so that they are parallel, right? Need it to be parallel. So, all right, how to use them? Well, you're always going to use them in pairs, either a fork and a wrench or two wrenches, and yeah, put them on. Here, I've got a couple on here, and I've got these guys set up so I can push them away from myself, and the section between the two of them is going to get bent tighter. If you wanted to loosen it, you can't just pull them together because they'd have to pivot around too much. One of them would have to be picked up and reversed on how it goes onto the steel to be able to loosen with it. But this is great. You could also have one from the bottom. Great thing about doing one from the bottom is we all have a natural tendency to kind of bend downward a little bit. And if we have one coming up from the bottom, we tend to reduce that tendency. You could even put this in the vise. Ooh, or you could use a scrolling fork and a scrolling wrench over the top. But the key thing is you notice that this jaw is fully in contact with, flat against, and perpendicular to the length of the bar. Same thing with this one. That's going to give me a nice proper scrolling. It's going to keep the sides of the bar vertical, right? If this is at a funny angle, if I wrench it around a little bit, then it's going to wrench the metal around and I won't be getting that nice parallel side to my jig anymore. This is not good. Do not do this. It is very easy to get caught up in this. Stop yourself and make sure you're putting them on so that the jaws are actually flat and parallel. Couple other notes on making a jig. If you can't see the problems with it, then you can't make the jig. I think it's really important to have done a number of hand turn scrolls that have gotten better and better, to have learned to see the shapes well before you can make a jig very successfully. Like I can see, this is the first jig I made. I was perfectly copying my instructor's scroll. But there's a nice little kink there and a flat spot. And if you can't see that, then you could end up with a jig with a kink and a flat spot. This is the drawing from the outside of it. It's got a pinch point in it in the negative space. Starts out growing negative space, then it's got a pinch point. Don't love it. So if this isn't making sense, go back to spending some time hand scrolling some stuff and really working on seeing the shapes, and then come back to jig making. I talked at the beginning about the importance of having the sides be flat and vertical. Let's take a look at one that's not. So this is not vertical. We've got a slope here. This is kind of bent in significantly because I hammered in the middle, right? Like you do. I didn't hammer in the middle and the bottom and the top when I was scrolling it up. So let's think about using this. If I scrolled around the top, that would actually be a much smaller scroll than if I scrolled around the middle of the center. And imagine how much bigger the scroll would be if I actually scrolled around the bottom of that center with it at that angle. And then if I come around here, if I go right down the middle of the bar, that's going to be a smaller, tighter scroll than if I'm up at the top edge of the bar. So this jig will make a wide variety of sizes of scrolls, and not in a good way. So make sure your sides really are straight up and down, nice and square, nice and flat. Okay, we have a jig. Now we're going to do a little bit of length estimating. So we've got a jig, we're going to use it, and we're starting on what's a half a scroll before a whole scroll. So I'll take my jig, lay it down on my drawing, and try and set it up so the outside line of the jig is sort of roughly on the inside line of the scroll. Rotate it around until it fits. A lot of rotating around with these guys. And I'm going to roughly eyeball it and say, it looks to me like right down in here where this kind of pale patch is on my jig, the half a scroll is somewhere in that area. All right, so that's about what I'm looking for. Next, I'm going to do a little mock-up of my scroll by using some soft, heavy wire and just tightly pushing that against my jig. And I'm going to scroll a little bit too long, right? This is that pale patch that I was going for. Scroll a little too much because we're using this as a tester. This will give me more freedom to mess around with stuff and see what looks right. What do you use for this wire? You can use something as thin as tie wire, 18 gauge, but it's really thin and a little funky. Pardon me. I know a bunch of people who use like old rows of solder, thick plumbing solder. That's great. If it's lead, please wash your hands before you eat. I went to my local art supply store. I'm lucky enough to have one. And in the sculpture section, where they have the stuff for clay sculpting, they have this stuff called armature wire, which is an annealed aluminum, and it comes in all kinds of thicknesses. And I got this 1/4 inch thick, because that's like up at blacksmithing thickness, right? So it actually gives me a reasonable bulk. It's a little more accurate for me. And gosh, I think that 10 feet of that cost me $7, and I've been using it for 10 years, 12 years. So armature wire is great. Anyway, make your test scroll. Make sure it's kind of fitting reasonably tightly to your jig. Bend it with some soft stuff. Then you can take it off and lay it down on your drawing and compare it. So what am I looking for in my comparison? Am I trying to make sure that this is lying exactly between the inside and outside line on my drawing? Honestly, I'm not. I'm looking for a few key things. So what am I trying to make it fit on? I want it to touch right here with where that other scroll is going to go, because that's where a collar needs to be. So that's important. Over here, I want to have it be about the right distance from that center line. Right? That's pretty important. And roughly the right width on the inside. And then the other really important place to touch is down here at the halfway mark. Needs to be touching where I'm going to be putting that collar in. So I'm setting it up so it's touching here near the center line, that it's touching over here where the collar is going to go, and it's touching here at the point where we're at the 1/2 mark. So, okay. And then I'm putting a mark on my armature wire, on my little mock-up, so that I can then bring it back to the jig, wind it onto the jig, and that I can transfer that mark over to the jig. This is my approximate line for what 1/2 of a C-scroll is for this drawing. So I've got my approximately 1/2 a C-scroll is there. That's good. The next thing I can do with this is I can straighten it out and I can measure it. There's my mark. I can measure it to figure out very roughly how much metal is going to be in 1/2 of a C-scroll. I'm going to take a moment here to talk about measuring. Since most of us are in the United States, this is a familiar system to us, those inches with all the hash marks in it. My ruler has 2 sides. It's important in doing this stuff that you are accurate and reasonably precise. If you are a little bit off, you keep being off by 1/8 and 1/8 and 1/8 and 1/8 and 1/8, it's going to add up and you're going to end up with C-scrolls that aren't C-scrolls. You're going to end up with those G-scrolls where one end's fat and one end's small. I don't know about you, but once I'm out to the, I don't know, what is this, 3/8 and 3/16, doing math with 16ths is a pain in the neck. Figuring out whether it's 3/16 or 5/16, okay, that's reasonable, but trying to figure out how many 30-seconds it is when it's an odd number of 30 seconds, I think that makes your work harder. So I'm going to make a pitch for using the other side of your ruler more often. Yeah, you may be making a frame that's 18 inches by 24 inches because it's going into an American space, but you can still do all the rest of your lengths on the inside using the other side of the ruler. This is, I don't know, about 21 centimeters. And if it was, it could be 21.2. If it's 21.2, I'm not going to say 21.2. because I got to keep track of a decimal. I'm just going to say it's 212 millimeters, and I don't have to keep track of a decimal. 3-digit number, I can handle that, and I can do math with that a lot more easily than I can multiply and divide by 16ths. So just a thought, do what works for you, but I think this prevents a lot of problems. All right, so we've got a length estimate for 1/2 of a C-scroll. So now we're going to do our test forging, and here's what we're going to need to do. We're going to test forge a 1/2 of a scroll. And you should, of course, as I said, have marks for halfway on your drawing, or it's really hard to do 1/2 a scroll. What do we need to learn? We need to learn how much metal is going to be used in the finial, whether the finial is just a simple taper like this, or a hay penny, or a blown over leaf. We need to figure out how big or long that finial should be, because if we want to have them look symmetrical, we have to make each of them be the same size, right? And then we're going to use that to figure out what the length of metal is that we're going to need for 1/2 a scroll. We're going to, compare it and say, hey, do we like it? This is the chance to mess around and make sure that what we're doing actually works, actually looks good on your piece, and it does what you want it to do. This is the place to spend extra time so that when you start cranking these guys out, it's a little bit more mechanical. One note, do not start your test forging. Do not do C's and S's without having paper for notes on hand. There are many measurements to record and use. That has been the biggest downfall I've ever seen, is students who started out without paper, wrote things down on their anvil in chalk, and then it wiped away, and then they didn't have it. Not so good. So first we're going to cut and measure a test bar. Well, okay, how long am I going to make it? Well, I can use that measurement from the length estimate. So what did I come up with? 8 and a bit inches, 210 millimeters. I need that much in a 1/2 a scroll about. I'm going to want a little bit more for squish. And then honestly, I'd love to do the test forging without a pair of tongs. So I'm going to add, yay much to that, so that I've got a nice handle that I can use to get it in and out of the forge. I don't want it too long, because as I come around on the scrolling jig, I don't want to run my hand and my test bar into the wall or something. But that gives me a sense of what I should cut. So cut it first, measure it second, and then write down the measurement. Write it down right now. All right, then make a finial, depending on what you're doing. Just make something that's pleasing. This is where the art comes in, right? This is the difference between the welder and the blacksmith, is that we make pleasing finials. I'm just going to do a ribbon taper here. So I'm preforming first, and then I'm starting steep on the end, and getting flatter overlapping blows, forging it out to its original width to get a decent taper on. And if it gets too cold, I might actually even, let's keep it straight, right? I might heat it up, preform it again, get that preform centered, forge down. Oh, I like the front end a little better now. It's much more delicate. And make it something that you think is going to look right. So I like how that looks. Doing an estimate, I've marked millimeters on the side of my anvil. But now I need to measure it. This is super important. I want to measure the length of my bar with that growth and measure the taper itself. So measure what the new length of your bar is, measure the size of your finial. And this will be a little bit more complicated. You might make a few more measurements if it was, say, a hay penny or a blown over leaf. But you know, how big was that square blob on that blown over, on that hay penny? How much did you have for the initial bend on that hay penny? So pleasing finial. And then we've got our new, we've measured the finial and we've measured the overall length. Write it down. Measure the new length, measure the length of the taper, write it down. You need to know both of those. So in this case, I think I had a 50 millimeter taper. I don't remember what it added. Now we're going to need to scroll it. So I've made it pleasing. And now I need to be able to make the scroll. So first we're going to actually do a little bit of hand scrolling of the tip. You do not start on the scrolling jig. You start like a blacksmith over the edge of the anvil, brushing down, feeding slowly, flipping it up and hand scrolling it until it looks pleasing. How much do we want? We want half a turn to 3/4 of a turn for our starting point. So I've got this, let's see, that's a half. I've got not quite 3/4 of a turn there. If anything, it should be a little too tight. You can always loosen things more easily than you can tighten them. So I've got that test scroll, I've got the tip scrolled, and now I get to go and check it on the jig to make sure it fits. This is a good idea. Better to make it a little too tight, and then you can just squeeze it against the jig hot and make it exactly match that jig so that you're producing consistent things. And then I'll take that tip over to my drawing and make sure that I like it, right? The whole point here with the test forging is we're trying to get a measurement, but we're also making sure that we're actually making the scrolls we mean to. So, well, it doesn't exactly match my drawing. It doesn't tip in so that the tips are facing each other, but I actually rather like it. It's kind of pointing towards the center of the piece, and I think it looks well proportioned. And I'm liking the size of the taper. So the taper is going to continue up to probably up in here somewhere, and that feels pretty good to me. So I'm liking it. If you felt like the taper was too long and wussy, now's the time to redo it. If you found the taper was too short and stubby, now's the time to redo it, right? Make a test that you like and it looks well on your drawing, looks good on your drawing. All right, now we can finish our test scroll on the jig. And again, we're going to scroll a little extra because we're not sure exactly where half a scroll is. Oops, back. Let's see if we can get this to play. There we go. So start by quenching that part that I did so that it doesn't unravel. Keep anything that's lovely. And then I got to thread it on there and grab hold with my scrolling tongs. It's a little bit tricky. It always fights you. And then I can pull it against the jig. And I'm stopping when I get to the cold metal. It's actually being held in place now. And I can get out my scrolling wrench and just make sure it's fitting absolutely perfectly against the jig, which is great, but it's not quite long enough yet. So that's a half. Not quite long enough. Get some more heat in the right spot. Second heat, finishing the scroll. Get some heat in the right spot, cooling off the stuff we don't want to have change. I leave some heat where the transition is going to be. Crank it on, pull the metal against the jig, and I'm pulling it a little too long, right? I wanted to stop in there somewhere, I think, but I made it scrolled a little bit more so that I can have some room for testing it and playing around. So that looks great. There's my half a scroll. So let's lay it on the drawing and compare it. Does it look good? Well, what's a good fit? Again, I want to make sure that it's touching this spot right here on the outside line, and it's touching the what will be the frame right here on that center line. So is it a good fit? Rotating it around until it looks good. When it's touching here and it's touching here, do I like where it is right here? Well, yeah, I do. That's got a nice little space to the center line. I like having a space to the center line on my C scrolls because it gives me some room for adjusting them, for tightening them and loosening them. I always like to give myself a little space to adjust things. So this looks pretty nice. So I've turned it around on the drawing until I said that's where I want it to be. And then I've marked the halfway point on this tester. So that is what half a C scroll is. Then I take that back to the jig, screw it onto the jig, and transfer that mark from the half a scroll onto the jig so I know exactly where a half a perfect, just what I want it to look like, C is going to be on the jig. And then this is so important. We need to know how much metal is in this scroll. Well, that would be a pain in the neck to try to measure, right? Balancing ball chain on top of it. So what we're going to do is simply measure the part we didn't use. So there's my mark, and I'm measuring the rest of the bar, the unused portion of my test bar. And then I can use that to be able to figure it out. Oh, I better write it down because it may not stick in my mind. So write it down as soon as you measure it. Okay, we have done our test forging, and the next part of all this is math. And this isn't even pre-algebra because there's no pi this time. This is elementary school math, but we need to get it right. And I know some of us have different relationships with numbers. So some thoughts on having this work and work well. First of all, write everything down. Don't wait. Do it now. Even though you're going, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh yeah, I remember that. You don't. Write it down right then. Even if it means losing heat, even if it means feeling like you're slowing yourself down, ultimately you save yourself time. Do something to indicate what each number means or each measurement. If you look at these scrawlings here, I'm not really sure what most of them mean. What does C 9 1/8 inches mean? I don't know. Much more helpful to say starting length is 457 millimeters. I know what this number means now, right? So take the time to do that and use units on all your numbers. Don't assume that you're going to know, oh yeah, that's the same as the other guys. Up here, 15, no idea what that is. 16 3/16 inch. Okay, that's inches. Cool. At 1.5. At 1.5 inches. At 1.5 turns. I don't know. I don't know what that means because it has no units on it. So use units. Okay. It's again, it's worth time. And I think my best advice is take the time to write your notes down so that it would work if somebody else was reading them. If someone else read them out to you, it would make perfect sense. Because honestly, it's so common. You start on a project and you think you're going to get it done today, and then you don't get it done today. And you're like, it's okay, I'm going to do it tomorrow and I can remember what these mean. And then tomorrow the washing machine explodes and you have to deal with it. And then it's, oh, okay, that's the weekend. I'll get to it next week. And then it's next month. And then you open up the notebook and you've got this pile of stuff that you knew that you understood what it meant. And you have no idea. And you have one C scroll and you go to make your second C scroll and you cannot make it match. And so now you have to start again with the tester because you, yep, we've been there, right? Because you just didn't put enough information down to be able to read them. This has been the biggest reason why I've had students spending extra years in my class because they didn't get their grille done because they didn't write down their notes well enough, right? So let's do some calculations. All right, these are my actual numbers from the piece that you saw. My tester bar starting length was 457 millimeters. That's a random number. Wouldn't it have been nice if you just made it like 500 or something? Don't fight that urge. I totally get that urge where you're like, I'm going to make that first thing a really nice, neat number. It'll make my math easier. You aren't. You're going to say, I'm going to make it a perfect 18 inches long, and it's going to be 18 1/8. And then you're going to ignore that eighth because it makes things too complicated. And now you have a 1/8 error in everything you do. And then it grows as you add the taper to it, et cetera, et cetera. You are much better off just cutting it at something that's reasonable and actually measuring its real length instead of pretending it's neater than it is. So my tester starting length is 457 millimeters, totally random. I drew a taper that was 50 millimeters long. Why 50? Because I liked how it looked. I kind of looked at 30, I looked at 40. I liked it. I felt like if I made it any longer, it was going to be kind of wussy. So that just looked good to me. Then I measured the bar again. These are all just measurements that I've already done. And the length with that taper was a bit longer. What a shock. 477 millimeters. Okay, great. So let's do some math. Hey, how much did the taper add? I'm going to write down those words in my notebook. Taper adds, and then I start with the longer length, 477. That's with the taper. And I subtract without the taper, 457. And I end up with the taper adds 20 millimeters. Okay, cool. Good to know. All right. So then I formed half a C and I measured the remaining length of the bar, and that was 282 millimeters. Pretty random. So now I want to know how much metal was in that half a C scroll. So I take my starting length, 457 millimeters. I subtract the unused part, the part that's not in the half scroll, and that gives me the length that was actually in the taper. And gosh, this math wasn't even that hard. 2 from 7 is 5. 8 from, okay, that'll have to be 15. That's 7. And then that's a 3 now. So 2 from 3, 175. I can actually do that. So that's giving me the amount of metal that was used in the bar from the original length without dealing with the taper issue at all. All right, I've just transferred this to the top of the page so that we can see that again. So that's the same thing. So now, gosh, how long is half a scroll with a taper? Well, it's this length, 175 millimeters, right? Plus the amount that it grows when you add the taper, which right here it said the taper adds 20 millimeters. So I add those 20 millimeters on, and I expect that when I get half of bar ready to scroll with the taper on it, it should be 195 millimeters. Okay, good. Really useful. Next, we have a half. Now we want a whole scroll. So a whole scroll before a taper, meaning the length I need to cut the metal off at to make a whole scroll, is going to be that 175 without taper times 2 halves. That's a half times 2 halves. 350 millimeters, that's my starting length. So that's what I want to cut the metal off at. And then after I draw those 2 tapers, so a half a scroll with a taper is 195 millimeters. So for a whole scroll, after I've done 50 millimeter tapers on it, it should be 195 times 2 halves, or 390 millimeters. If I have a bar with 2 tapers that are 50 millimeters long, and that bar is 390 millimeters, I'm going to make a nice symmetric C scroll. I have everything I need to make a symmetric C scroll. If I don't, if that length is a little different, I'm not going to make the same C scroll as the piece is that length. So for consistency, that's my goal, is after the tapers are forged, 390. If this is a little off, it's okay. I can mess with the tapers a little bit, but I gotta nail this length. Where do all these numbers go? They go in a notebook. Don't get a piece of paper and write numbers down and then stuff it into your bag and then pull it out and hope that it's there and have it sitting on your anvil blowing away in the wind. All right? No. And then you burn it. You use it to light your next fire. Don't use a random piece of paper. Have a notebook. Yes, it's going to get filthy. It's not a pretty notebook. Okay, this one's kind of pretty because it's red. It's going to get filthy. It's going to the shop, but have a notebook. Write your numbers down there. That way they will stay. They can't blow away in the wind. All right. So now we have all the information we need. We know what a pretty finial is going to be for our drawing, for our piece that we're making. We know what length we need to cut the metal to. We know what size we want our finials to be. So now it's time to actually forge a C-scroll. So here's the steps we're going to do. We're going to cut the metal to the length we just calculated. We're going to forge both finials, one on each end, and we're going to confirm that the overall length is correct. As I said, that's the important length to nail, right? Just like we did on the tester, we're going to hand scroll both ends because we are blacksmiths and not welders. And a welder, when they use a scrolling jig, the inside is this straight, flat section. It's ugly. But we are self-respecting blacksmiths. So we're going to hand scroll over the edge of the anvil so that we get these started. And then we're going to finish on the scrolling jig or form or tool. And we're going to jig each half to the center mark. And we'll do that twice, one for each side. And that should give us a C-scroll. And then you'll see why, but it's never going to come out perfectly flat from the jig. So we'll flatten it out, and then we're going to check it compared to the drawing and see how things went. So cut the metal to length. I think I said 350 millimeters. So there I am, 350 millimeters. Yep, easy peasy. Now you want to find and mark the center mark, because if we're going to make a symmetrical scroll, we should be doing everything around that center mark, right? That's going to help us to do things more symmetrically. And this is how my first blacksmithing teacher, Dave Vogel, taught me to find center marks. Balance it on something round. You can use the horn. Balancing is actually super sensitive and will help you find the exact middle very quickly. And just mark right where it's touching. And then I'm going to double check it. But this is a lot faster than actually measuring for the center. Check one end, flip it over, check the other. Let me double check that first end. Make sure that those measurements are exactly the same. They are, yay. So I want to be able to find this mark later. So I'm going to get my center punch on there, place it carefully, and just give myself a little mark. So I've got my little center punch mark, and I'll be able to find that later, even after it's been through the fire a few times. So now I know where the two halves are compared to the middle, and I'm ready to do symmetry. Now, next, forge your finials. You're going to start on one end, right? Forge your finial. You're going to watch me forge a lot of tapers here. Forming my taper, making sure I've got it well centered. And make sure you're working to that measurement that you did, right? You want to make your finials the length of the finials on the tester. So I'm paying attention to that at the same time that I'm trying to make this attractive and just the right width. Snap, snap, snap. It's getting a little cold. Need a little more heat. Just bring it in a little bit more. Want that front edge to be a little bit thinner. Nice overlapping blows. Forging it out to its original width. Do pay attention to width, right? Only have your stock get wider than the original if it's intentional. So then I'm checking against my quick measurement, and then I'm going to measure to that center line from the end, right? And make sure that I've got the right measurement. So I've got the right length for my taper, and I've got the right length to the center line. Always better to stop a little too early and stretch it out a little bit more than to have to cut off the end, right? All right, then we do the other end. So didn't want you to have to watch me make me entire finial again, but finishing it up, trying to be consistent, right? Getting a similar thickness at the front end, keeping my width consistent, trying to bring it down to the same length taper each time. So I need to do several measurements here. I need to measure to the center line, and I need to measure the taper. And this is the final important check. Whoop, make sure I've got it right to the tip. And then I can check, and it should be 390. And in fact, that's the 39 mark right there. So yay, my whole piece, both halves are the right length and the overall is the right length. Both of those are important. Now we're going to hand scroll the ends, just like we did before. Do pay attention to which side they're on. Whoops, because it matters. So let's scroll over the edge of the anvil. Scrolling down, 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 down. Flip it up, tighten it, pay attention to figure out where you need to tighten it. I'm always looking at it to see where I want to tighten it. And I did, again, more than half a scroll, less than 3/4. It's pretty good. Little quality control here, little brushing. So I've got one end. Now let me scroll the other end. There's that first one. And I'm going to flip it over. Wait, did you see me just do that? Let's back it up. And I flip it over so the two scrolls are both facing the same way because it's a C scroll. Need a little more material in there. Scrolling it up, lifting my hand so I can scroll a little tighter. So a little more than, I want more than 180 degrees. So I've got both of those on the same sides because it's a C scroll, right? So that looks like that should work. Now we're on to the jig. And we're going to try and jig around to that. There's my bright shining center mark. That's where I'm trying to get to. And I want to have it fit well in the middle and jig it nicely. So quenching that inner part so that it won't unscroll as I pull it onto the jig, grabbing it with my scrolling tongs, pulling it against, dropping it down a little bit so that it gets a better fit, pulling it against the jig. If I feel like there might be any gaps, I can get out one of my scrolling wrenches and just pull it tighter against there. Notice I didn't go into the cold section at all. You only scroll the hot stuff. So here I am, second heat. This is cold where I want to preserve it. And now I'm pulling those last bits against. And I'm paying really careful attention to where that mark is and getting that metal just touching at the mark, but not touching just after it. That's the key, right? I want this guy to just be tangent. I don't want to stop too early. I don't want to go too late, just to the mark. I'm also actually looking to see if that center punch mark I have is landing right there. It should be. If it's not, I got a problem on the inside of my scroll. So there, I've scrolled half of my real C scroll. So now I flip it over, scroll the second half. Definitely using tongs here because I'm having to hold on to something that's scrolled up. It's pretty short. And so quenching the inside so that it doesn't unscroll, kind of winding it on there, holding it in place, pulling it around. And I'm kind of out of heat. Notice, hang on, notice this bar, the first C is now running into the space of the bar. So that's why I'm working kind of high on the jig here so that this guy can actually cross over. I can't just push flush on the middle of the bar because I won't be able to get a full C scroll. All right, we'll continue. So making sure I've got a good fit again. I really do like a good fit for consistency. So there's partially done. I've got a G scroll. It's not complete, skinnier in one end. Quench the middle to preserve it. Make sure you've got heat where you need it. I'm going to need to lift that up a little bit so it's in the right spot. And now I'm slowly working it against the jig. And again, you can see the first half is crossing over the top on the jig. And I'm going very carefully just till the steel touches the jig at the mark. And look, I've got a C scroll. Isn't that satisfying? So, but because I had to do that crossover thing, right? Let's go back here. Because I had to do this crossover thing, this C scroll's a little bit off flat. It's not perfectly flat. So before I go messing around and comparing it to my drawing, the next thing I want to do is actually flatten it out. And I seem to have a tendency to always have one piece of film that's out of focus. And this is the piece of film that's out of focus for today. Apologies. So lay it down. There's my C. Got a little general heat in there. You can see it's rocking back and forth. It's not sitting flat. So grab hold and knock it down. I'm doing this like I do all flattening, which is I'm moving it around so that the part that isn't flat is sitting up above the anvil and I smack it down onto the anvil. I'm knocking the daylight out until it's sitting nice and flat. Let me say that again. You want to go back to your blacksmithing fundamentals. You guys know that if you have a bend in a bar, you don't want to try and whack the tip down. It'll just rock back and forth on the anvil. Well, even though this is scrolled up, you still don't want to do that. You want to be setting this down so that any humps are coming up and you've got 2 points of contact on the anvil, and you're smacking in between them to flatten it out again. So I'm moving this around because I need to get it set up so that it's supported, so that I can smack the right parts down. And a pair of chain tongs that can grab around it this way is really helpful. So lots of shifting it around so the right parts are on the anvil, so that the part I need to flatten is to bend down is in the air, and just keep moving around until it's lying pretty flat. Okay, so I flattened it, and now I can go and compare it to my drawing and see how it fits. Hey, it's touching here and touching here and touching here. And these guys are about the same distance from that center line. So that's pretty damn cool. I've got it fitting in the space. It's not exactly on the line right here. You know what? That doesn't actually make a big difference. It's still going to look pretty good. We've got it doing what it needs to do in the places that matter the most. And these two tips, the finials, are pointing in directions that are mirror images of each other. So really, I could put a mirror right down the middle of this, and it would look the same as what I've got sitting there. When you check against the drawing, you might even want to look in the end, make sure that that center punch mark is right on your center line, because that, oh yeah, I got those two guys just right. That's great. If this is off a little, maybe you want to take a closer look and figure out if things are actually copacetic. So we've made a C scroll. Yay, we're done. No, what if I wanted to do an S scroll? What's different? Well, it's the same basic method, okay? You're going to test forge half a scroll. Now, half an S is to the center mark here, little X marks the spot. Any S scroll you do that is actually symmetrical is going to go right over the top of the center mark, not to the left of it, not to the right of it. If it goes to the left or to the right, then the two ends are not symmetrical. The center of your S needs to go directly over the center mark on there. Okay. This bar could be nice and straight like this, or it could kind of swoop down a little bit more and then bend in and come across and then swoop across. That would be fine as long as it goes across that center mark. So that's key, like the center mark was before. So what do? Well, you test forge a half an S scroll, and you do all those same measurements you did. You make sure that you like the finial. If you're using the same finials you see, you already know something, right? But you still need to bend it around and make it actually fit the drawing and figure out how much metal is in half of an S, which means, of course, measuring how much isn't and subtracting. Calculate out the length for half of an S scroll. Calculate out how long it should be without the finials and with the finials. And then double that, do your math. Cut a bar that's long enough for both halves, mark the center, because you're going to really need to adjust it so that goes right over that little X. And then, as we did before, you're going to forge both finials, forge the finials on both ends. You're going to double check the lengths to make sure that each half an S is just the length you want. You're going to hand scroll the two tips. And then you're going to get onto your jig and scroll them until you've gotten it all bent around to the center. Now, just a reminder, but a C scroll and an S scroll, you want to do that hand scrolling the tips on opposite sides on the S scroll, right? When you do the second scroll, the first one should be facing up in your hand, where on the C scroll, when you did that second scroll, they're both facing the same way. Fortunately, you're a blacksmith, and if you screw up which side this is on, when you do that initial scroll, you can go back and undo it and fix it, which is convenient. It's nice to be a blacksmith. We've made scrolls. So now we need to make sure that they actually are to measure and that they do have a good fit. So again, what does a good fit mean? A good fit means that you are nailing those key contact points, that things are meeting each other in the right spot. You don't want this meeting point between the S and the C to be a little to the left, a little to the right, because that's going to change the symmetry. These two guys are really nice and symmetrical around that spot. So I don't want to mess it up. And I want to have the whole piece, which is going to have multiple parts to it, multiple elements in it, looking symmetrical. So I have to have each one of these hitting those key spots, every single one. So even if some of the bits aren't identical, if they're all fitting in the right places, then it's functionally identical. And as I've said, I think it's a bit of an opinion, but I think that one of the things that makes you see this as symmetrical, see this as being consistent, is that the finials are pointed the same ways. So if these two guys on either side of this spot are oriented similarly, then you'll notice it. It also is a really good idea if the ends are the same shape, right? But you're going to notice where these are clocked more, I think, than whether this is precisely the same diameter as this bit over here. So what if they don't fit? This one, I got too happy on my scrolling jig and I scrolled right past the center mark, and it's they're kissing each other in the middle. It's too tight. Gosh, but yet, so you need to look at what your problem is. In this case, you know, the two halves are still really symmetrical. So that's good. They're just, they're not touching out here and here. So I really kind of just want this thing to be wider. I need to open it up and make it wider. So where should I do that? Well, they're so symmetrical. I don't want to do it in the inner part of the scroll. If I just flattened out the back a little bit, that should open it up nicely. So put the heat where you need it. See a little glow there, and then adjust it. If you've got a scroll that's reasonably symmetrical, that heat is usually just going to be in the center of the scroll so that you keep it symmetrical. And how do I do that? Well, in this case, I just can use a pair of tongs, scrolling tongs stuffed into the finials, and pry on it, and it'll push those two sides apart, and I won't mess up anything about the rest of it as long as this is hot over here. In fact, I did a little bit of film on expanding or contracting to fit your C-scroll with some well-centered heat. So here I am. I've decided it's, well, first I'll try and make it a little longer so it can reach out and fix stuff. I've got the heat really well-centered around the center mark. That'll lead to a consistent bend. Just pulling that apart, and look, it's now wider and still lovely. And then I can squeeze it together if I decided it was too wide and make it a little narrower. And because I had well-centered heat, look, these guys are still clocked. They're still oriented symmetrically around that center line. I've got a nice even curve here. I haven't done anything to these lovely scrolls, and they're still connected to each other in a nice way. So again, you want to have your heat well-centered, then you can simply push or pull the cold, beautiful scrolls, and all the change is going to happen in the back. Any flattening, any extra arcing is going to happen in the back, and if it's well-centered, it'll happen right around that center mark that I've got. Yeah? Really great trick. What if you don't have the heat as badly placed? Well, then, I don't have the heat really where I want it. It's off to one side. So when I do that same little clever trick, and that, oh gosh, I had it in the wrong part of the fire. What happens? Well, it opens, it's gotten longer, but this section's flat and this section's still bent. If I try to draw a line down the center, these guys are no longer actually pointed in symmetrical directions. Okay, so what if I have something that's not symmetrical and I need to fix it? Well, that's when you get out your wrenches and you figure out where the bend needs to be. Oh, I gave myself some space to discuss that asymmetry. Figure out where the bend needs to be, and you put your wrenches where you want the bend to be, and then you just tighten it up a little bit. Don't do all of it in one spot. It's never in one spot. Figure out where you need to have a little bit more so that you're making a nice, gentle, pleasant, symmetrical bend, right? Use a pair of them, make sure that they're on there and they're nice and perpendicular to the length of the bar, and you can wrench stuff around. Do it thoughtfully. Heat's usually in the center if you have two symmetrical ends, but it's not always. Here's my S scroll. It is just too wide at the top. Okay, well, this is lovely over near the center. I don't want to mess with that. So I'm just going to tighten the bend here so that I'm narrowing the whole thing. So what have I done? I've put my heat in the area I need it. I've actually chalked the area I need to tighten, that makes it easier for me to remember. All I have to remember now is tighten it or loosen it. That's a great trick for your scrolling jigs as well. Figure out where you need to change the scrolling jig, rub some chalk on it so you know the area you need to change, put it in the fire, and all you have to remember in the fire is tighten or loosen, right? Tighten or open, tighten or open. And then when you pull it out, you just get the wrenches on that spot and you do that one thing you're supposed to do, compare it to your drawing again, and you've got it happening. So sometimes you need to have the heat in other places and you need to adjust it so that, there we go, much better. It's skinnier now. Hey, the center mark's crossing the center. It's just touching the line here. It's just touching the line here, which the camera angle makes it hard to see, but that's better. You should be, if you've cut your bars the right length and you've forged your finials the right length and you've used your jig correctly, that should give you all the adjustment you need. A little straightening to loosen it up, little rolling it in to make it a little smaller. Occasionally you'll have a situation where you just realize that what you really needed was an extra 3 millimeters on the length of that bar to get everything to work right. And where can you possibly get that? So this is the secret fix. And when I say secret, this is totally legitimate. Okay. You don't want to do it too much, but this is a legitimate fix. If you just need to make the bar a little bit longer, first of all, don't do it over in the nice part of the scroll. Do it in the middle of the C or the S. You guys know what a flatter is, right? A flatter is a nice tool that you hammer onto metal and it's flat on the bottom and it flattens it. A flatter that is slightly not flat, that in one direction has a very slight arc, just in one direction, can be a great way to fix things. This little guy, you can actually even use it cold. Tapped down on this metal, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to make the bar slightly thinner and it's going to stretch it out just a teeny bit. But when we look at the scroll from the front, you're not going to see any thickening or thinning of the metal. So you won't probably notice that it got a little bit less width this way, right? So it's a little bit teeny further away from you. Nobody's going to notice this. This is a great secret weapon. And now that you know it, if you go look at historic ironwork and really nice pieces done by Sam Yellen or something, you can spot some places where the almost flatter, not quite flatter, was used to just stretch it out a little bit to make it fit. Last few thoughts on adjusting to fit. Hot metal, as it cools, contracts, right? So don't test your scrolls hot. Test their fit when they're cold. That way you'll actually know whether or not they fit. My buddy Dave Carroll, when he was working on his level 3 grill, that long leafy bar with 2 scrolls in it and 4 leaves on it, had to meet both top and bottom and the sides and the whole thing. And he got that thing adjusted with the wrenches and it dropped in and it was beautiful. Set down his wrenches, went to get a drink of water, came back, and there was a gap. It had shrunk because it cooled. I've definitely seen a couple level 3 grills that were adjusted hot and were not adjusted cold again. And there were tiny little gaps. So we'll be better than that. Test it cold, figure out what needs to fit, heat up what you need to, adjust it, cool it again, test it. That way you're getting an accurate test. And finally, when you've got the parts fitting together nicely, all in the frame, mark them. Mark their locations. Yes, this C scroll is absolutely identical to this C scroll, and yet the whole piece fits together a little better when they're in these locations than it does when I have them flip-flopped. So figure out where everything works the best and mark it so that you know which one goes where. I'm using 3 hash marks here. I'm using 1 hash mark here. And this way you also know which is the top and the bottom or the left and the right of the C scroll, so you don't flip it. That way you're keeping your lovely fit recorded. So I've got my S, all marked on top surfaces, so I know which way they should go. And I've got my triple hash mark and my double hash mark and my little X, so I know which one goes where, and everything's fitting at the collaring points, which is great. Cool. I wanted to back up and take a moment to talk about proper jig use. Jigs are fantastic tools and they can make things go really well, but you do want to use them right. There's some ways to use them wrong, which can end up being frustrating. So let's take a minute to talk about jig use. For accuracy, again, some of this is redundant, but that's a good thing. You want to make sure that you have marked on your jig what half of an S or half of a C is, so that you're always scrolling to exactly the same point and you should have exactly the same scrolls. You also want to mark the inside because you're not necessarily using your jig the same every time. You might start a scroll further around on here, right? Mark it so that you know where it should match for the inside as well as the outside. That's what helps to get those finials oriented in the same directions so that it looks really great. Then you're going to hand scroll over the edge of the anvil, right? The beginning of the scroll. Then you want to adjust it to fit the jig. And we talked about this, but we talked about it pretty fast. So let's actually look at doing this. So I scroll it up too tight because it's a lot easier to straighten something out than it is to bend it. You're never going to get a tip bent against the jig just by squeezing it with a pair of scrolling tongs. So hand scroll 180 to 270, half turn to 3/4 of a turn, too tight, and then bring it to your jig and get it adjusted just right. So I've got this too tight. I've got it dropped on. It's not really going down far enough. Let me give it a little whack. There we go. And then I'm going to give it a little squeeze here, squeezing some daylights out, and pulling it around until I'm looking for that tip to line up. I'm squeezing the daylight out until it just fits perfectly. So that's going to give me a consistent finial every time. Let's look at that again. I'm squeezing the daylight out. I'm also pulling my hand around until this spot, the tip of the scroll, is lining up with that line that I just drew, right? So it's not able to get there initially because it's too tight. Get it down. I'm pulling it around a little bit, squeezing daylight out, squeezing the daylight out, and I'm pulling it around a little bit until the tip is lined up. So I'm looking at two different things. Getting the tip lined up with the right spot and squeezing the daylight out so that I've got a perfect fit for the inside of my scroll. People definitely see the insides of scrolls. It's what looks cool on them, right? They notice them. So this is where you want it to be consistent because they'll notice when it's not. There I am, lined up. Tip of my scroll is just on that line. I have an excellent fit here with no daylight between my scroll and my jig. Yay. Then we're going to scroll on the jig. Well, there's two general things you can do. In both cases, you always want to have whatever you've scrolled quench part of it first to preserve it. You want to leave a little heat in the transition into the flat stuff so that you definitely get a nice transition. So start off with quenching part of my center. I left part of that bent stuff hot, putting it on the jig. I'm going to grab it with my scrolling tongs just to help keep it in the right place. And then I just am pulling it firmly, making sure it's going firmly onto the jig. And I'm stopping so that the last bit that touches the jig is still hot. Never pull any further. That just tells me time to stop. But I've got a good firm fit. Something to notice, I'm not even down all the way on the jig. I'm actually perfectly level on here, but because I haven't done anything weird, this is just catching the top edge of the jig. Small overlap is giving me a beautifully scrolled scroll. That's great. Okay, let me finish it. And here I can pull it against the jig. I can also use the scrolling wrench. So more of it is quenched because more of it is finished, but I still have heat in the transition from what was perfect into the straight bar. And I've got plenty of heat where I need it to bend. So I kind of wind it on, and then I start where it was already fitting, moving along, using my scrolling wrench to pull the metal against the jig. Start from the inside, work towards the outside. If you start from the outside, you could end up with some weird gaps in the inside you're going to have to fix. Which scrolling wrench should I use? Well, let's check out the fit here. I've got an opening on my scrolling wrench that's wide enough for the width of my thick scrolling jig and for my metal with a little bit of space in there. That way I give it a little bit of a crank and it pulls it against the metal, against the jig. If I use an opening that's too big, it's going to be a long swing before I get the scroll pulled against the scrolling jig. If I use one that's too tight, I won't be able to get it over both of these, so that won't help. Just a note, you may need a smaller opening on the inside of the jig where the bend is tighter and where the jig is thinner, right? Let's watch that again. So quenching the stuff that was good, I kind of wind it onto the jig until it holds, and then I'm pulling on it, but I'm using my scrolling wrench to pull it against, pop it on, give it a little bit tweak until it's against the jig. So that's proper jig use. Now, it will help if you try to keep it level. So we marked our jig, we adjusted the hand scroll to fit the inside of the jig, we're quenching the inside stuff. Try to keep the scroll as close to level as you can while still using the jig, because then it'll be closer to flat and you'll have fewer errors happening. You want to make sure that to do that, you've got space around your jig to be able to do this big overlap, right? We've got the center. There's half a C. I need some space around here to be able to swing it around and keep it on the level. Closer to level, more accurate jigging. What if you are just, oh gosh, we all do this. You are really happy about this guy and you are so determined to get it to meet that line. You're like, it's got to meet, it's got to touch, it's got to touch. So I just keep pulling and pulling until the metal is touching there. But wait a minute. What just happened? This isn't hot, so it didn't bend. And as I pulled it against the jig, the metal bent in the only place it could, where it's hot. And now I've got a gap between my scroll and the jig. So that was not proper use. I need to heat that guy up again in all the places where it's got an error. Thread it back on. I've added some heat a little further down here. That might help. And there's two fixes. One is you can use a mallet. And use the mallet just like you use a hammer to flatten a bar. You're going to start in the place where the gap is the biggest and smack that down until it's flat. And if you see any other gaps, you'll go and fix them. Why a mallet? I don't actually want to forge out the thickness of my metal. I just want to get it to bend. And by using the hide mallet, I'm likely to bend it without doing any damage. It'll also stink a little bit from that hide mallet smoke. I could also use a scrolling wrench. And again, start from towards the inside and work your way around, pulling it against the jig. Look, getting rid of the daylight until I've got a better fit. That is so much better. I want to look at that again because I want you to see what's happening when we over scroll. So the issue is that I've got the heat in here, but I keep scrolling. So I should have stopped when that last bit of heat was touching the jig. I keep scrolling into the point where, that happens all the time, by the way, where the cold metal is against the jig and it can't bend. So it is levering this stuff away. And again, your best fixes, either a mallet or a wrench, whatever works for you, whatever you're feeling at the moment. But make sure you've got the heat where you need it and that you start in the spot where it's worse. If you're using the mallet, if you're using the wrench, start where things are perfect and work outward. Start near the center and work outward until you've got a really nice fit there. So, something to avoid. All right, just to finish up, let's talk for a minute about other finials. I've done this whole thing with lovely little ribbon scrolls. Aren't they elegant and nice? But you might want to make S's and C's that have other finials on them, that have, you know, hay pennies and snub ends and even blown over leaf scrolls. Oh my gosh. I might want to do a fishtail scroll because that's required on the level 2 grill. So what happens with these? What's different about them? Well, the basics are the same. You're going to do an estimate of what's half a scroll, and then you're going to test forge half a scroll. Notice, gee, this level 2 grill, you're going to need a mark on here for what half a scroll is on each half. That's going to be really, really important in order to get the 2 halves on this scroll. Because this is a weird scroll. It's an S, and yet it's not actually symmetrical because it has 2 different finials on it, right? We really need to know where the middle is so we can make this work right. Test forge a half of this scroll. Write all that stuff down. Test forge a half of this scroll. So you're forging a different finial. You're going to have a different length change. You're going to need a different amount of material to reach a half. Test forge a half of this guy. That looks like a fishtail bolt end scroll to me. Test forge that. Figure out how much material is in that finial for a finial of what size. You know, if you're doing a snub end or a hay penny, how big a penny? How thick? How long is the taper behind it? Right? That's all pertinent, and that can all change the length for half a scroll. So make sure you get that all written down. Once you got all your measurements, then it's just some calculations. If you're doing 2 different finials on the ends of one bar, make sure that you add the right ones together so that you cut the bar to the right length. So this one, I need to have the length for half a ribbon and half a snub end added together. I don't want to get my calculation for the beveled scroll in there. It's not going to help. Cut it to the right length, forge the finial on one end, forge the finial on the other end. Make sure that you have the right length after both finials. Compare it to what you said it should be. And then scroll it up. Cool, right? Make sure it's fitting in that space. Should be to half the width, should be touching here and here and here and here. And it's all good to go. Other things to think about with other finials, your jig, this jig that I've done here is a great jig for doing a ribbon scroll. It would be good for a fishtail scroll, something that's thin at the front end. It's not going to be good for a snub end scroll or a hay penny because there's no space in here to fit the penny in. So you might want to make one jig. I think I'm answering your question here, Jim. You might just want to make one jig that starts a little bit later, or you might make 2 jigs, one that you use for your ribbon and your fishtail, and another one where you start a little further out. Start the jig a little further out on the scroll that leaves space for the centers. You could hand scroll those centers and just compare them to the drawing and then have the jig pick up partway along. With the ribbon and the fishtail, or you could make 2 jigs, one with space, one without. I got to say, something like a blown over leaf, how the heck do you jig that? I'm not even entirely sure. I think that the inside of a blown over leaf needs to be hand forged, meaning hand and anvil, and then adjusting it just using your scrolling tongs and scrolling wrenches to get this to land on the line perfectly. And then you can go to the jig with the outer part. So if anybody comes with a brilliant blown over leaf jigging that we can also use for other stuff, that'd be great. If you're doing a piece that had 47 blown over leaf scrolls, oh heck, make a jig that does this negative space right here that does our dinosaur head perfectly. And that way you can make every single one of them look the same, right? Wouldn't that be cool? Another idea is rather than always just starting with the drawing and making it match that drawing, you're the blacksmith. So ultimately the drawing should actually come from you. You're also the designer. So if you are designing a piece that has some tricky scrolls, like a blown over leaf, like a bevel scroll, one way to approach it is instead of drawing it and then trying to match the drawing, instead, forge a really pretty one that seems to fit your space well and trace it and then base the rest of the drawing around that, right? Do all the measurements when you forge your tester so that you can reproduce it. But forge a really pretty one that's just pleasing to the eye, and then use that, this one's pretty, put it into your drawing and draw everything else around that. I think that's actually a really good approach. So let's take another look at this issue of different kinds of finials in one piece. I'm actually going to criticize this drawing a little bit. I think finial orientations make a difference. I think it's one of those things that people notice. I also think negative space inside the scroll, people won't be able to say it, but they notice it. When they look at two scrolls and they say they're not really the same, that's one of the things that's making them say that. These two things make them say that. One is, are the finials pointing the same way? And is the negative space similar? So looking across at these two guys, well, this one's pointing due south. Cool. This one, really similar negative space, except right at the inside because it's got a little more mass. All right, that's fair enough. But I'm not sure they're clocked the same. When I see a round blob on the end, let me come down to the hay penny. The way I see the direction that this is pointing is I draw a line across the middle of the penny from where it joins the bar. So I draw a line right across there. So this guy to me is a little bit angled, right? This one is due up and down. This one's not quite due up and down. I think this one needs to be scrolled a little tighter so that it's pointing more up and down. This one, I think, is pointing in too much. I think it needs to open just a teeny bit to have those finials clocked the same way. This one, pointing straight up. Yay! So that's cool. If we looked at the negative space, this looks pretty similar to this. So these are reading as reasonably symmetrical that way. You look across these two, doesn't that look kind of funny? I mean, I know this one has a lot of line weight change, and so it's going to be different, but it looks a little funny. And I think it looks a little funny because the person who drew it made a point of having the top surfaces match right here, that's a horizontal line between those two. But it means that the negative space inside is really different. It makes this guy look like he's crunched over more than his friend on the other side of the symmetry line. I suspect that this would look more symmetrical if the negative space, if right here, if there was a straight line between this and this, the fact that when I connect those two, that's a sloped line, I think that's what makes this look more sloped. I would actually love to see that open a little bit more, even though this would then be above that. You got to make some decisions to make sure it looks good. But things that do matter when you're doing these tricky things, the spot where this scroll touches here needs to match the spot where this scroll touches here. Those need to be the same distance from the end. The spot where this is touching needs to match where this is touching. That needs to be the same distance. So these little negative spaces in here, those match. I come down here, the spot that this touches is the same as this. Now, those are not the same as the spot where this touches. This is a short distance. This is a longer distance because of the S. But this should match this. These should be right across from each other. And these guys should be mirror images of each other. They should be the same distance from the outside and the same distance around the center. So look, lovely symmetrical negative space in there. Isn't that nice? That's part of what makes it look good. So those are some of the finer points that you might want to pay attention to in design. It goes a little above and beyond, but there we go. So we've made C's, we've made S's, we've made them fit, even if we had to use a not quite flatter to do it. And now we're ready for joinery. And that, I think, is actually a different webinar. So we're done with that. So questions, can we bring everybody back? You can turn your video on. Hi. So I see Jim said, do you have to make 4 jigs for 4 different finials? As I said, I don't think you do. I think you could make a single jig and have it work for all of them as long as you paid a lot of attention. Make that jig have space for the penny. As long as you paid a lot of attention to the hand scrolling of the inside on the thinner ones to make sure it matched the drawing well. Or you might make 2 jigs. You might make one for the ones that have a taper on them and one for the ones that need space for more. Jigs are a lot of work. And once you've got a good jig, you'll use it for years. and years and years and years. And if you try and cheap out on it by using some thin stock and doing it really fast, you're going to be frustrating yourself with every single scroll you scroll on there. And if you do it in thinner stock, because it's easier to bend, and it's work to bend that thick stock to make a good jig. You start trying to correct something and wrench something against it, and you straighten out your jig. You add kinks and flat spots to your jig. Unless you are absolutely perfect at always making sure things are perfectly heated every time, and you're so gentle to the jig, I can't do it. Make it out of beefy stock. Just really make a nice, ridiculously strong jig. It's work, but it's worth it. It'll pay off. Other questions? Anybody?
How much height do you like above when you're the center part of your jig?
Good one. Yeah, the center part. You know, the right one. What does that mean? Well, as you saw, you don't actually need to have your C-scroll completely touching all the way along the side of the jig, right? But if I'm mostly working in 1/2 inch wide and 3/4 inch wide, then gosh, I've probably got about 5/8 sticking up there. I should be able to do 3/4 material on that and have it pass itself just fine, right? If I was regularly scrolling stock that was a lot wider, I might want to have the inside part be a little bit taller, because I still want to be able to catch enough of it on there so that I'm getting a really good scroll, right? But I don't know, what did I do here? This is inch thick, and I think I not quite doubled the width on the end. That seems pretty good. Yep. Still left lots of thickness on the inside there. This is not an attractive scroll. It is an attractive, yet thinner stock attached to a base plate. I have seen that a lot, right? You do it in thin stock, you weld it down in several spots to a bar that can go into the vise, or you weld it onto a flat plate. Sure. And if you need a quicker jig that you're going to use a little bit, do that. And if you need 14 jigs for this one project and you're going to use each one of them 3 times, do that. But if you're going to use this jig a fair amount, I think that is a waste of effort. The amount of extra time it takes to do it in the thicker stock and make it actually strong, it feels like more because it feels like more. But you're going to be wiggling it around and tightening and loosening and tightening and loosening and tightening and loosening and tightening and loosening to try and lay it on that line anyway. I think the thinner ones, they expire faster. They can still get, if it's sitting up there 3 centimeters and you're wrenching on the top, you can still distort it with a little bit of aggressive action. You also, if it's welded to a plate, you can't get your wrench down as far. So a little limit. So yes, that's absolutely a possibility. But I think there's an argument to be made for having your first couple jigs be nice and sturdy, and especially do one with a golden ratio scroll on a thick stock. You will use that thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over, because it'll just whip out gorgeous scrolls. You'll use it on things that you're not making C's and S's on. You'll use it for, I love making the little heart trivets. And people love buying those guys, and they love watching me make it on the jig. I feel like I'm cheating, but sure, I'll do that. Yeah, if you keep the stock that you're bending nice and hot and your jig is nice and cold, go ahead and use the thin stuff. I want to point out the pitfalls before you put a lot of time into it and then end up frustrated when you distort it on your second C scroll. You can't make 2 to match, right? That's so frustrating, because it really does take a long time to make a good jig. And if it doesn't take a long time, it's probably not a good jig. Cool. Other questions? No? That's it? Is anybody working on the level 2 grille?
I asked a question in the chat.
We gotta get smart.
Question in the chat from Jim. Did I answer that? No, JC. Oh, is a scale drawing of that scrolling jig? Is that your question?
No, what measurements on the grill? I did not see those on the certificate online for certification.
Victoria, are there specific measurements for that specific grill? Or yeah?
Yeah,
And
there
what-
are.
I didn't see them online. That's the only reason why I'm asking.
Yeah,
What
it's
stock should we be using for the frame, scrolls, and collars?
I think
3/4 by 3/8.
yeah, the stock is supposed to be 3/8 wide.
Diameter's 10.
And
The diameter's 10 inches.
It's
Lex, that's a different piece.
Okay.
That's not the CBA. That's the Vista grill,
Okay.
not the CBA grill. Yeah.
Okay.
What was
And-
that?
9 inches by 13.5 on the outside to the
Outside. And one of the things to always keep in mind is stock hot rolled is never precisely what it says, right? So you need to decide whether you're fitting outside measurements or inside measurements, and then make everything else just fit from that rather than getting it too worked out. My understanding, Victoria, correct me if I'm wrong, is you can draw a different thing. The rule is you got to have those 2 square corners. You got to have the rectangular frame that's held by 2 mortise and tenon joints. It needs to be filled by 2 C's or 2 S's, and those have to have different finials, one from each of the families. So a ribbon, some kind of a fishtail, a snub end or a halfpenny, and a blown over leaf or a beveled scroll. And if you don't want to do this particular design, you need to draw one that shows all those and send it in first and say, hey, I thought I'd do this version. Yeah.
Yeah. And what happened was it used to be that you could just draw it and do it, but nobody was
Doing it.
drawing it. And then they would say, what do I do? How do I do it? So they came up with this a while ago. And that seems to be a much more successful program because it's kind of like a test, this isn't, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but it's not the grill you're going to put in your window and be like, "Ooh, that's the most beautiful thing ever." It's an exercise.
It's an
and
exam.
Getting it's a test. It's an exam.
So the point here is that the decision to make precisely this grill design was curricular, just to help people actually move forward and get it done. So if you want to do exactly this, do exactly this. If you're like, I want to do 2 C's facing each other. No, I want to do 2 C's against each other. No, I want to do 2 really long C's back to back. That's okay.
it is.
But you have to draw it first before you forge it to prove that you can do that. That's cool.
And work that out with your coach or your instructor or your mentor, whoever you're working with. And this is an exercise in forging to dimension and fitting something inside another thing. And until I did it, I didn't realize what I didn't know. Like it was just doing this was such a huge educational moment, right? Like it was like, oh, so that is a different set of skills. Like some of the tips and tricks Beth shared with you, my big takeaway, and I think Beth mentioned this, how it shrinks when it gets hot. So I'm fighting this thing. Mentioned that to my instructor and they're like, oh yeah, just do the last little bit cold. And it was like, what?
Yeah, exactly. If you need to
chunk, it all fit into place.
Yep. That make sure that they fit cold fit. Even if you have to heat it up again to adjust it, like fit it in there, go, oh, it's not quite right. Get out the chalk, get out the white charcoal. It survives the heat.
Mm-hmm.
Love the white charcoal.
Mm-hmm.
Rub the part that needs to be fixed, heat it up,
Mm-hmm.
cool it, check it.
Yeah. Well, and the little bit that Beth talked about where, if you've got it just a little too short and you thin it ever so secretly,
Spread it out. Spread it out.
You can do the same thing with the frame. Like, let's say it got a little too long. Upset it ever so slightly. You're not going to seal it. You can see it. You're going to file away those edges, and it's all going to look perfect when you're done.
Well, and the nice thing about this frame is you make two pieces, and as long as they're both right angles, right, you just lay them on each other and you move them around, and then you cut them off.
Then you cut
right?
them off.
Then you cut them off, and you make the tenons first, and you make the holes for the tenons second, and then you cut it off outside of the holes. You don't cut off the length on the hole parts and then try and put a hole in there, because then the hole's going to move. No, you do the tenons first, and then you kind of go, okay, that's where they need to go. And then you make your holes, and then you cut off the excess.
Mhm.
And then you have a perfectly rectangular frame. Yeah. Other questions?
I had a question about that moment that you showed where you scrolled into the cold part of the bar and
Yes.
created daylight. Could that actually stretch the bar then? So now you're working with a piece that's too long, your scroll is too long, or is it just a bending problem?
Yeah, it's unlikely to, because what's going to happen is the bar is going to find a way to do what you're asking it to do in the hot area. And I can't taffy pull hot steel. It really does just bend. It'll kink really badly so that you can get it, the handle part around at that right angle. But no, it won't stretch it out. I would say that when you're correcting, you can avoid stretching out by not using a hammer, right? Using the mallet against the jig instead is going to help avoid stretching it out.
Mhm.
Yep. But no, it looks like it is, but it's not. It's not. It's, oh, you're just so focused on the wrong thing at that moment, right? And then you go, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Others?
The metal is a tattletale. It'll.
You did a bad thing.
I'm doing what you asked.
I'm doing what you asked, but I wasn't hot there. Did you notice I could not bend because I was not hot? So I had to lever. It was all I could do. Yep. Anyone else planning on working on the grill have any thoughts on the grill? Any questions on the grill? Massive excitement about the grill. So I think you could, I think, Victoria, I think that the drawing has that also in 3/8 by 3/4 for the scrolls itself, but you could do them in thinner stock. You just need to, draw it.
Yep. Adjust
You
your
do it-
math. Yeah.
you could do
I
it-
did the whole thing in the 3/8 by 3/4.
Yeah, but you could do it in quarter by. Yep. That'd be fun.
For the grill, there's only the collar between the scrolls. How do the scrolls stay inside the frame?
I'll take, do you mind if I take that? So
Not at all.
there's two collars, right? In there. And the requirement is that you have collars. That's the requirement. You have to have some collars, right? But this is where you get to make choices. And isn't that lovely? So you need to attach it to the frame. You could attach it to the frame by having more collars. You might want to have them be a little thinner, right? You could attach it to the frame just on the outsides, on the verticals. You could attach it just on the horizontals. You could attach it everywhere it touches with a collar. You could attach it with a rivet on some of those spots. You could, I think technically you could even do a drill and tap and put a little flush screw in there. But this is where you get some choices. And I would encourage you to go, okay, what's my skill set? What am I good at? And what do I want to learn? And pick one of the things you want to learn, right? So if you're like, I can rivet for days, then do more collars, right? So you're doing collars of different sizes fitting into different places. If you're like, yeah, I got that collaring down, man, but riveting, I haven't done a lot of that, then maybe you want to add a few rivets just to grow yourself, right? I haven't misled anybody, right, Victoria?
No, that was
Okay.
perfect. And
Good.
I did rivets, 2 sets on each end. I didn't do everywhere it was touching. Some people do everywhere you're touching. You got to bend the scroll out of the way to get to it. I did not bother with that. And the big helpful thing for me with that was once I got everything to fit, now I'm starting to drill holes, right? So do one set, put a bolt in there.
Yes.
Don't let it go. Then do the other side, put a bolt in there. Don't let it go. And so now you're going to end up with 4 little bolts that you can take out one by one to rivet or tap to screw or whatever you want to do at that point.
And just to throw out there, if one of those holes is just a little bit off, you know, you got a hole in the frame and you got a hole in the scroll. If they're not quite meeting, figure out which one the is going to be covered up by the rivet head. You can just enlarge that a weeny bit by a little wiggling around with the drill bit, so that you can actually get that thing to connected. As long as it's covered up and the whole thing is stable, nobody needs to know about that. That's totally legit. Yeah, I actually, I always thought all grill work is held together strongly in every single spot. And I was so amazed by some of the collars that Sam Yellen does, because he does these crazy things with wings on them and stuff, and they're flapping over on the inside. And like, wow, how do you even get that tight? And the answer is he didn't. Everything was well held to the outside frame. And then in the middle, there were some little flexi spots. I mean, there's some grills that are absolutely gorgeous. There is a gate at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Sam Yellen, this set of rings, these beautiful, insane winged collars going around it. And if you push on it, it flexes. It's not going to come out. Nobody's going to get through it, but it's not actually held tight. He's thinking in the big picture. Overall, is it doing what it needs to do? Yep.
There's some great center punches that are made for specific hole sizes. So you get a set and it's different drill bit sizes. The trick is you do not hammer those, you just drop them in. If you hammer them, you'll eventually ruin the very fine tip. But so that's something, if you're doing your, making the holes and all that, if you do the ones on your frame first, and you scroll in there and you just drop it in, you'll get your center punch directly in the right spot on your scroll.
Either that or you need a really skinny pencil.
Yeah. They have markers that actually also have like really long tips for marking on the inside of holes.
Transfer punches. Thank you, Jim.
That's what it's called.
Always nice to know the right terms. It's easier to go and ask somebody for it at the store when you know what the name is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the first time you went to the metal store and you went, I need the kind you blacksmith with.
Well, and I just bought a set. I don't know when I did it, but I bought a set of those from Harbor Freight and they weren't even that much money and you don't use them very often. They were holding up just fine.
So if you use it right, yep. Those Harbor Freight investments, I tell you.
What about using my TIG welder?
So I'm going to say on this, no, seriously. I mean, if you're doing a bunch of grill work, that's a legitimate thing to TIG things together and then cover it up. But on the level 2 grill, that's not legit. Because the point here is there are only 2 elements in there, right? You are not trying to get a lot of stuff to get together, and you should be able to pull that off without getting out the TIG. On the other hand, level 3 grill, in the middle of it, where you have 5 pieces meeting each other that has a single decorative collar around it, you've got to do something to connect those guys before you try and put that collar on. You are not going to just go, okay, everybody just stay, because 2 of them aren't touching in any other places. They are only touching there. So they have to be clocked around, the 2 C scrolls, clocked around exactly right. Yeah, MIG it, TIG it, drill it, screw it, do something, right? But on the level 2 grill, in terms of the skills you're trying to build and get confident with, not this time. Yep, not this time.
That's a fail. It's a fail. Okay.
Yeah. It's just, push yourself, man. Push yourself.
No, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's purely a joke because I know you, but.
Okay. But let's say you did it under your collar. I'm not taking it apart to look.
Yep. We're not going to know. Yep. It will not be known.
And if no one knows.
Now I'll say this, if I was examining one of those, I look for the collars to be tight. So if you hit a TIG weld under there, you better still make a collar that fits really, really nicely. The eminent blacksmith that I took a class with who said, it's never a jig, it's a form. Okay. We were figuring out how long to cut a piece of metal for a collar. And he was coming up with I came up with a number and he was like, no, that's too short. Turns out he has only ever used collars to cover up MIGs. And all of his collars have space around them because they're not doing anything. And I went back and looked at his other work and he could like stuff quarters in there because it's just covering up. So if I can stuff quarters between your collar and your scrolls on a level 2 grill, no. It is testable. If I can't, if it's really firm on there and there's a MIG weld hidden, right? Yeah. You still got to make a nice collar. But I think it's a good challenge to try and put a collar on, to learn to do a collar onto a piece with that isn't all completely 100% stable.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But
That's
it's
the
the
next
last thing you're
webinar.
going to do. It's pretty stable by then. I mean, and it's MIG would be overkill for that.
Mhm. So we're gonna talk about that in the next webinar. And I'm going to be demonstrating with the grill we've been doing down at Vista for years, because our curriculum overall is much bigger than the statewide curriculum. So we do a simpler grill, but it's not as much of an exam. But it's 8 collars. And so the only thing holding it together is collars. And we're going to talk about how to get it stabilized before we put the collars on without a MIG, without a screw. Yeah. Yep.
I'd say it's this sort of thing is a really great test for a lot of things you can do. In my welding courses and then the ornamental ironwork course at Cabrillo, I think it was sheet metal fab and then the ornamental ironwork. We had to do a frame each side was a different type of bend and welded. So you got your 45, you've got, it's angle iron. You got one where it's cut out, where you got to cut your angle iron, different shapes. You got one where you have to cut a sort of curve into it and then heat it and bend it and then weld it. So it's a great thing to test yourself and see if you can get them all to the right dimension.
Yep. Yeah. Definitely part of the fun.
Well, Beth,
Cool.
I just want to say I really appreciated this class because you took a lot of the intimidation out of like how to measure things correctly, because really this stuff looks so badass that when you go to like a museum and you see it, it's very intimidating. Like, how
Yep.
did they do that?
Yep. But like some of that stuff, you just whip out a bunch of, once you got that C scroll measured,
Yeah.
47 C scrolls, frame, collar, grill. Yep.
Yeah.
The measurements, doing your measurements in the right places and writing them down, I just cannot emphasize that enough. I have had so many poor students who've had a miserable time because something wasn't written down in a way that they actually could reuse it. So that's if that's your only takeaway, write the freaking measurements down.
I kind of had a headache at the beginning of this class, and right now I'm just really inspired to try to do it now.
Okay.
So I just want to let you know.
Yay!
Yeah.
Yay!
Sure.
Cheers.
For sure.
Awesome.
Also, if you don't have a piece of paper to write down your measurements and you have to write them on your anvil or something, take a picture of it.
Yeah, don't do that. Just don't. I'm just going to say it right here. There's some times when that's the right thing to do and take a picture. But when you write it on the anvil, then the next thing you know, you've just hammered on that spot and it's gone. Right?
And I never write on the anvil. Usually it's
write it on that rusty thing. Write it on the hood.
exactly.
Right? Write it on the hood. Write it on that rusty thing on the wall. Write it on the table. Take a picture. But boy, you better remember to take that picture. And if you're going to do that, you are saying at the beginning, I am willing to risk losing this data. Right? And that's fine. But if you aren't willing to risk losing it, then I always have a notebook with me at the shop. I just, always have a notebook at the shop.
That was kind of That was kind of huge for me too, because my bass player came over for rehearsal the other night and was writing on loose paper instead of putting it in a book. And so that kind of like crossed over into music, like
Yep.
put it in a book.
Put it in a book. Put it in a book where the pages don't come out, even if it's something where you're
Yeah.
like, that's not any good. Just put a big X on it and leave it in the book. Don't tear it out. Don't do whatever. Just go, this didn't work. You still have the data, right? If you're a scientist, you know this. This is like keeping a lab notebook. Everything goes in there, good, bad, ugly. You never erase anything. You just put a line through it so you can still read it. And
That was huge.
it makes a big difference. This is not your friend. Good, cool. Anything else?